we have some some breaking news for you. We have a new U.S. Women's National Team roster drop. This is the group that will be brought in for the 2-game April SheBelieves Cup series. 1 game against Japan, and then a second game against either Canada or Brazil, who obviously you might remember from less than a month ago in the CONCACAF Gold Cup. The way the Gold Cup sort of extended into March makes this a really quick turnaround. These are 2 international periods back to back. A lot of exciting stuff going on in this roster, though. It's not super surprising that we're seeing some change from the Gold Cup, not least because I think there are some injuries being dealt with here, though they were not confirmed in the release. We're seeing multiple new players get brought in. This is moving into real Emma Hayes territory. These are the last 2 games before Hayes takes over, and I think you're starting to see her hand on this roster more and more. So let's read the list, and then we'll get into it. So goalkeepers, Jane Campbell, Casey Murphy, Alyssa Nair. Standard, same as always. I think they're getting into a pretty tight rotation there. Defenders, Abby Dahlkemper, Crystal Dunn, Tierna Davidson, Emily Fox, Eva Gaetino, Naomi Girma, Casey Kruger, and Jenna Neiswanger. Midfielders, Corbin Albert, Sam Coffey, Lindsay Horan, Olivia Moultrie, Emily Sonnet, and Lily Johannes. And our forwards are Catarina Macario, Alex Morgan, Trinity Rodman, Jaden Shaw, Sophia Smith, and Mallory Swanson. So, I love to say it. There's a lot of things going on here, but that's good. We want that. Like I said, by far the most Emma Hayes-esque roster we've seen thus far, pulling in every American that played in the Champions League last week. We're seeing Champions League play rewarded. A little bit more Eurocentric, which I think no one is shocked about based on not only bringing a Hayes in, but also some of her public comments surrounding last year's World Cup. I think she would like to see more diversity in experience in the United States roster. But this is Hayes also doing 2 separate things, which I think we saw Vlatko do about 4 years ago, which is that they're putting together an Olympic roster, but they're also trying to set the stage for the new era of the team. And so there is some talent identification going on here that is definitely everyone has a legitimate shot at the Olympic roster, but also there need to be communication lines established for a player that maybe doesn't make the Olympic roster so they do not feel like they are being forgotten. But let's start with the main headline here. Catarina Macario and Mal Swanson are back. Both have played minutes in their returns for their clubs. Macario has been on more limited minutes, coming in late in games for Chelsea FC, but she's been incredibly efficient in that time. I think it's 3 goal contributions in 4 appearances now. Maybe 5 over the weekend. I don't remember, but she's looked really, really sharp, though she hasn't played very much. Consecutive minutes, I guess I should say. Swanson a little bit in the opposite, where she has been building minutes actually really nicely. She's playing about 60 minutes. She's played about 60 minutes in 2 games for the Chicago Red Stars thus far. She's yet to hit the back of the net, but it's clear that she's working on kind of building the comfort level after being out for a full year, and the goals will come. No one is really expecting her to be at her sharpest just yet. Her club coach, Lauren Donaldson, actually said this week that he's expecting that to happen in maybe about a month or so. But she's looking healthy. She's looking fit. She's looking like she's getting her pace back. Really nice to see those players back. Those are players that I think to this day, it's a little bit underrated just how much they were missed at the World Cup. You definitely say next player up with a team with the depth like the U.S. has, but those 2 are incredible. And you just kind of look at that list and you go, yes, we're getting closer. The team is getting closer to perhaps what they would like that lineup to look like for the forwards in the Olympics. I think obviously 2 really notable things are the Gaetino and Johannes first senior call-ups, both play in the Champions League. Gaetino previously played for Notre Dame. She went over to PSG, which I think they're rewarding that as well. I think that's an ambitious move for a young player. She scored a goal for PSG in the Champions League last week. On the upswing, she's a defender, which is also, I think, useful for the U.S. as they sort of figure out those lineups after having some questions in the defense in the Gold Cup. And then Johannes is also a huge storyline. She's only 16. She's lived in the Netherlands since she was 10, and she plays for Ajax in the Netherlands. Really technical footballer, wonderful midfielder, really talented player. She is absolutely going to be a player that plays internationally at the international level. The greater question was for who. She is an American citizen. She was born in Virginia. She is not yet a Dutch citizen. That would take a little bit longer to go through, I think, the naturalization process there. But the head coach of the Netherlands women's national team has asserted that she is at least interested in representing the Netherlands, which is the country that she lives in, and one that she has lived in culturally for a number of years. Though obviously a manager like Hayes is going to want to bring her back in with the US to make sure that she's sure about that decision. Hayes had some really good things to say about Johannes because they actually played Chelsea in the Champions League last week. She was not speaking directly about recruiting her for the national team, but just sort of generally talked about how much she rates her. And I think she also just had a really good statement about Johannes is going to make the right decision for her. Her getting called into this camp is not a finalized decision either way, but I like that she's weighing her options, and I like that the US is pushing for this because this is a really talented player, and you don't want to fall into a habit of saying, oh, well, we have really talented players playing in the United States, so we shouldn't pursue these other nationals that are playing abroad. And I think actually that's one of the great things about this new Emma Hayes era is that she is going to do that. She's going to push for, again, more diversity of experience. She's going to try to scout outside of usual or more traditional US scouting, which is usually through college or NWSL or the US youth national teams, though Johannes has experience there as well. It's the kind of swing you have to make to stay relevant on the global stage. And whether Johannes decides that she would like to play for the US or whether she would like to play for the Netherlands, which again is 100% her choice and where she will feel most comfortable, it's good that the program is pursuing this because she is a fantastic player. Some of the notable absences, we saw, unfortunately, Midge Purce suffer an injury against Portland this weekend. The release for the roster drop did not say in either way whether any absences were actually injury related, but I think maybe you can construe that injury influenced Purce's absence, also influenced the absence of Rose Lavelle and Lynn Williams, who still have not played for Gotham yet in 2 matches, coming back from the Gold Cup with light knocks. Again, not confirmed, but just a possibility, I think, kind of reading between the lines. A player who did play in the NWSL this week who was not called in was Becky Sauerbrunn. Very difficult at this moment to kind of tell where she stacks with this team. She had a rough performance against Mexico. She's still an incredibly important leader for them, obviously. They're trying to figure out what the center back rotation needs to be while feeling probably pretty good about the starting 2 of Davidson and Girma right now. Dahlkemper, who also had a rough game against Mexico, does get called in. Hard to see exactly where the logic is going with this, but I do think Sauerbrunn's absence is notable. But I think the injuries in the other position spots, the injuries in the forward line and in the midfield kind of worked out for the numbers, where I'm not sure anything else there are really snubs. Just not enough NWSL time either for any of these other players to work their way probably back into form. And then I also just like that there's not that much handholding in terms of veteran leadership with this group. And that is something that is earned by the Gold Cup experience. I think if they had not had the Gold Cup, which there are downsides to the Gold Cup and what it did for players' fitness in preseason and how it took them away from their club teams, and probably not necessarily the best timing for overall development during the course of the year. But it does mean that these games, there doesn't need to be a lot of veteran handholding. There doesn't need to be one known 2015 or 2019 World Cup winner on each line, though they do have that because that's a large portion of the team. I think you go through that experience and you grow from it. And they went through some really tough games in that tournament. And suddenly you go, no, well, I'm the veteran, at least right now. I just went through this Gold Cup. We're putting this group back together. We're bringing in a couple new players who are going to integrate into this tight-knit group that we've developed over that experience in February and in March. And I think it sets them up well. I mean, I said this the last time we talked about Gold Cup. I think it's going to pay huge dividends for that team so long as it does not affect their fitness long term. Things I like a little bit less about this roster. This is just quick hits, obviously, and I'm excited to see the games, but I'm still not entirely sure what the plan is for the defensive midfield, other than kind of hoping that Sam Coffey continues to progress and Emily Sonnet is still a good option there. And there hasn't really been enough time in the NWSL for perhaps a player like Andy Sullivan to work herself back into the conversation. This gets more into formation and tactics necessarily than just personnel, but that it's a part of the field that the U.S. is still not solved. I think we still saw that in the Gold Cup in spaces, and I'm not sure that this necessarily addresses that. I think that the U.S. is really interested in in very creative, on the ball, attacking midfielders, playmakers. How do they spring attacks? How do they move the ball well? How do they possess? But they're not necessarily focusing as much on who's going to win the ball. Are they going to play, 2 defensive midfielders? Are they going to play 1? Do they have the personnel for 1? I think with Coffey and Sonnet, you say, okay, maybe against some teams, not against other teams. why are you bringing in all of these great attacking midfielders if you are going to have to play that double pivot with the two defensive midfielders because you're not necessarily as confident in personnel as a lone number 6. I think that those are the questions that we're going to see more going into these games. And then the center back depth is still a question, I think, as well. Davison and Gurma, clear first choice. Dahlkemper, a good fit, simply maybe by way of working with Gurma at their club team. Gaetino is a little bit of a wild card. I'm excited to see what she can do. I hope she gets some minutes. Sometimes those work, sometimes those don't. But like I said, there's two things happening here, which is that there's experimentation happening to get ready for the Olympics, but there's also this tending to the health of the player pool that's happening. And that was something that Vlatko Andonovski, I think, started out really strong at when in the early days of his tenure with the U.S. And then I think it got maybe worse and worse as the pressure of results started following him a little bit more. Some of those early days with Vlatko, he brought in Alana Cook, who was in danger of being poached by the English national team. He started working in some of these players like Macario, like Smith, like Trinity Rodman, just getting younger players in the player pool, working players through. Well, and also a lot of that happened post-Olympics because, like I said, that marriage of results and process has never been an easy one for the United States women's national team. But I like that this is happening before the Olympics. I hope that Hayes is empowered to be brave when she actually makes the Olympic call, because as we saw last time, there was, I think, a little bit of being timid in actually getting players experience at a major tournament while understanding that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win it. But also, I don't know, sometimes your best players are your greenest ones. And the U.S. has taken that approach in the past too. So I'm excited to see this group play. I hope, as always, that that the approach to the formation, the approach to the personnel that they put out on the pitch sets them up to succeed. And I hope that SheBelieves remains productive, because this is the last one before Hayes comes in, and then it's truly crunch time. And then finally, turning our attention to the NWSL, which had another full slate of matches this weekend. Like I said, it was a women's sports utopia in the United States. Had many screens going, got snacks, hung out on the couch, watched a lot of sports. So 2 weekends in, most of the league have played 2 games. 2 teams have only played 1 due to the Challenge Cup. And we're seeing some, I think, exciting trends, hopefully. Like I said at the top of the show, not going to get too granular, can't go game by game, but some cool stuff already. Some cool stuff already happening in the NWSL. I think the main one that came out of the weekend, if we're looking at the standings, is that Chicago and Kansas City are at the top of the table after finishing 2023 in the bottom. The Red Stars are the first team in NWSL history to win their first 2 matches after finishing the previous season in last place. Really impressive, even if it's just sort of vibes, tenacity, and a little bit of luck. On the flip side, San Diego and Portland are in the bottom this week. Surprising turn for perennial contenders, raising eyebrows a little bit, though obviously for San Diego, that's simply 1 loss, but for Portland, it is 2. And we'll kind of get into what that means in a second. So, not going to get into games too much. It's been enough days have passed. I'm just going to kind of put this into tiers, I think. Not necessarily power rankings, because those stress me out sometimes, but more just what is the vibe coming out of some of these games. So I'm going to start with and I've named these myself. These are my personal tiers for this week. In the soccer is a funny sport tier, I'm putting North Carolina and Louisville. Both of these teams did not win their games this weekend, but they probably should have. North Carolina actually lost to Utah, and Louisville drew Houston. But if you're looking at the underlying stats, if you're looking at the chances created, if you're looking at, North Carolina had 2 penalties, one of which they missed and the other which got saved. These teams should have won. It's the kind of games that you walk away from and you go, not happy necessarily with the result, but I'm happy with the process. If you're the coaches, North Carolina should stick to the game plan. They have actually overrun their opponents in 2 straight games. I think they just got a little bit unlucky, and I'll get to what Utah did there in a second, but both head coaches for these teams should feel pretty good. Stay the course despite dropping points. The NWSL is a funny league. Sometimes the ball doesn't bounce your way. So don't get too shocked if you're looking at the results for these 2 teams. This one is you did everything you possibly could. You executed the game plan and didn't go your way this time. My next tier is the we know how to play NWSL ball tier. I'm going to go with Chicago, Utah, and Kansas City. 3 winners this weekend. All teams won fairly against the run of play, fairly against possession stats. None of these teams necessarily held the ball a ton, especially Chicago and Utah, I think, to highlight. You don't always need the technique to play the most beautiful form of soccer to get the results that you need. And I think especially we like I said before, with Chicago and with Kansas City, there are things that need to be addressed that go sort of beyond just the X's and O's. Some of it was just, I think, Chicago talks about needing to kind of change the team culture. Kansas City is trying to implement a better defense, and it works sometimes and it doesn't work sometimes, and they're working on it. They don't hold the ball as well without Debinha, who is dealing with a hamstring injury. She will be back a little bit later in April. But yeah, if you just look at the mental side of the game, the ability to play without the ball, the ability to do last-ditch defending, holding a lead, I think all three of these teams did that really well, and they're going to want to improve. I think that if I say on the flip side that North Carolina and Louisville should feel fine, I think that these teams should feel good about the results, and also like they have a lot of work to do. Chicago in particular did not do a great job of holding onto the ball at the end of the game, and they got lucky is maybe the wrong word, but they kind of put themselves in the position to have to do a lot of defending. I think I said this last week, as many times you're going to concede as many as you save in that regard. So they're going to work on control. They're going to work on technique. They still have some gaps in the midfield that they need to figure out. But Chicago, Utah, Kansas City, very good NWSL ball clubs, and no one's going to want to play them. And I think the number one thing you can do in the NWSL, if you're still figuring out asserting your own style of play, is simply to make yourself very difficult to play against. And these clubs should feel good about that. And like I said, for teams like Chicago and Kansas City, what a breath of fresh air to feel like you're on the side of the good for once, and you get to work these things out from a winning position as opposed to feeling like you're falling into a hole. There's kind of this middle-ish tier, the figuring it out tier. I'm going to put a bunch of teams in here: Gotham, Washington, Orlando, Angel City, Bay FC. We're seeing some interesting progression. Gotham played a risky high line with that new look defense against Portland, which worked, but it was close. They had Portland had 2 goals called for offside. Sophia Smith really could have gotten one in that game. They kind of score against the run of play. They get away with a 1-0 win. Washington takes all 3 points at the death with goals from 2 rookies. This is, I think, a good indicator of how they're dealing with their rebuild, which is that it's not always going to be perfect, especially right now, but they think that the upside of some of these younger players is totally worth it. And I think we saw the benefits of that. We're seeing the players that they sent out, like Sam Staub in Chicago and Ashley Sanchez, play really well for other clubs. And you think to yourself, oh my gosh, how could they send these players out? And then you see the rookies play and you go, oh, well, those rookies are also very good. So I think Washington got a good point of emphasis on their internal logic for this season. Orlando and Angel City played to a stalemate. Both teams playing very open, very committed to their style of play, to end-to-end kind of soccer, willing to take risks in both attacking and defensive areas. I think both of these teams are going to be able to score goals this season. Orlando is still waiting on their star striker, Barbara Banda, I think due to just sort of getting the visa issues figured out. But the question is control. I don't know if these teams necessarily have the ability to control games just yet. That comes down to the midfield and the possession from the back line. So those 2 teams are actually going to be really exciting to watch, but I think they would like to control the game a little bit more. And then Bay FC, I think, just learned a valuable lesson about not mentally switching off. This was, I think, a growing experience for them. I still think Asisa Oshuala is the best new signing in the league. I think they're going to be fine. I think they are certainly a work in progress in just their second ever game as a club. But yeah, a valuable lesson for them learned this weekend. My I'm not worried, but I'm a little worried tier is the Reign, Portland, and San Diego. Maybe San Diego and the Reign don't deserve to be there. It's hard to say. They have clear arguments for being in that sort of soccer is a funny sport tier, but there are maybe just more underlying issues for them that they are probably going to need to address to avoid results like these in the future. The Reign outpossessed Chicago. They just could not turn that dangerous movement into clear-cut shots on goal. Jisoo Yun had an incredible goal this week, but that was a shot from distance. It's just too typical for what we see from the Reign. It was a little bit similar to what we saw last week. Last week they get the win. This week they don't. I'm curious to see if they can kind of break out of that rut and go on more of a run to turn some of their possession into goals. San Diego had the better run of play against Kansas City. They are also, I think they can make a fair argument that many of their players' involvement in the Gold Cup put them at a fitness disadvantage going into the early part of the season, but they still just have big midfield questions. They did not invest a ton in their midfield in the offseason, and I think that is, again, it's hard to control games when you don't have the middle of the pitch in your favor in that respect. It turns things into you have to move the ball quicker. You have to, and Naomi Girma and the way that she can progress the ball, and so can Abby Dahlkemper, does help a lot. But it just feels like there's that missing piece for San Diego that would make them even more dominant than they already are. And then with Portland, it's a little bit more obvious. They're 0 for 2. They've lost 2 games in their first 2 matches. The midfield didn't look super connected again. Sophia Smith is doing a lot of work on her own. The defense kind of fell asleep on that goal against the run of play from Gotham. Things are just not quite clicking. I think that's on the coaching staff and the general manager. I think that they had some players leave and they had some players come in, and it's just not clicking yet. And you just kind of have to wait and see if it starts to. But I understand why Portland fans might be a little bit impatient with this project and feel like it's not necessarily clear how the Thorns have improved from last year, and also wishing for a little bit of a heavier tactical hand from the coaching staff, because I think last year Mike Norris found a lot of success by letting the team play like they had in their championship winning season. And this is not the same team. So you want to see more from your coach in that respect. You had the one really steady season where you let the team play. But what happens when you have to assert actually your own philosophies and tactics into the game? And then I have one, it's a dubious tier, the I'm worried tier. And that goes to the Houston Dash. All of last week's caveats apply. Brand new coach, early days, figuring out a new system. They're still giving up a lot in the defense. Shout out to Jane Campbell for a ridiculous performance this weekend to give the team a point. They're not making much in the attack. There are so many things that they need to adjust. Now, I don't know, maybe you shift the formation, you make the balance a little bit different, you give a little bit more help in the defensive midfield. When you have questions in the defense and questions in the offense where you're giving up a lot of goals and you're also not really shifting that by making the tempo push or getting more shots of your own, I am always in the inclination that you should focus on the defense first and then build from there, but they have a number of season-ending absences. I don't know what's going to happen with the Dash. I think you can't expect Jane Campbell to stand on her head every single game, and it's going to be kind of a brutal learning curve. What can happen? I mean, I've had people say to me before that the NWSL is a little bit more of a slow game than you might think, and I do think that's true. You cannot win or lose the league in probably the first 5 to 8 weeks, which can feel like a long time for fans, but trust me, the season is long this year. But you can start to compound the underlying issues that are causing you to struggle with results. And I think for the Dash, the danger that they're in is if you're working through a system that is clearly outmatched, how long do you develop in that system to try to make it improve? Or how nimble can you be to make changes to, again, just try to make yourself a little bit more of a tougher outing rather than feeling like you're giving up too much space in the back for an attacking system that is not working. And this has been The Late Sub. Shout out to producer extraordinaire Parker Fenton. I am your host, Claire Watkins, and we will see you next week.